dedicated to empowering you with information
to make positive choices
and be advocates for your overall well-being.
Welcome to The Health View. Welcome to The Health View. I'm Yvonne Dunitz, and this is Dr. Laura Chan and Dr. Margarita Ochomaya. And our topic today is the effects of sugar. I want you to really listen to this next fact. Sugar is a commonplace in our diet, and today the average American consumes 22 teaspoons of sugar a day. Can you imagine that? So we're going to talk about all that sugar and the effects of it. And of course, I would think one of the first effects about that would be weight gain.
Absolutely.
So talk about that a little bit.
Well, sugar is quite high in calories, and it can sneak up on you because you don't typically feel very full when you consume it. For instance, in a soda. There's a lot of sugar in a soda, and you can drink it but not feel satisfied at all in terms of your hunger. So we can eat a lot of sugar, which is high caloric, but not feel satisfied in terms of our hunger. So that's one big cause for weight gain in that regard.
Okay, anything more you want to chime in on weight gain, or shall we go to hormone imbalance?
Well, we can talk about weight gain so much, but I think with regards to hormone imbalance and weight gain, they kind of both go together. And interestingly, not everything needs to be sweet. So when we talk about sugar, we're really talking about a molecule called glucose. And glucose is pretty much the number one brain food. And so our brain really relies on glucose for functioning, but not all sweet things need to be, the other way around. Sugar doesn't always feel sweet. So a carbohydrate is a mother molecule of what glucose would be, and we have some carbohydrates that don't necessarily taste sweet. So for example, a healthy carbohydrate could be a sweet potato, but as much as a sweet potato has less carbohydrates than a regular potato. So when we talk about glucose and hormone imbalance, maybe what we could do is take it a step back and talk about the hormones that are involved with glucose, and therefore also understanding that in the context of weight. And glucose has a hormone that relates to it, and the name is insulin. So insulin is a very important hormone that allows glucose to enter into the cells. And without insulin, when people who have no insulin at all, they have type 1 diabetes. And in people who have a problem in handling that relationship between glucose and insulin, it's type 2 diabetes. So I know we're elaborating a little bit more down in the show. So, but I thought in terms of hormones, the hormones that are mostly involved with sugar would be insulin, and there are others like glucagon and leptin, but insulin will be our number one focus today.
So in saying that, you may have already addressed it, but when someone asks us what is insulin and where do we get it, where would that be?
Wonderful question. So insulin is a hormone, and a hormone is like a communicator. So the way I explain it is, for example, you have a cell phone, I have a cell phone, but our unique cell phone is what a hormone would be. So when we dial that phone, only your phone understands that number. So that's how I reach you and not reach you, Laura. So that hormone signaling and understanding how it works, it's very unique to the specific phone that you're calling. And so insulin is produced in the pancreas, which is a gland in our belly, usually kind of in the middle, and it secretes insulin as a part into the bloodstream. And once you find it there, it goes into the individual tissues, and at the individual cells, there is a receptor, like that being your phone. That cell receptor for insulin is either working or not working. So we have three cases. We have one where insulin is not present at all, and that would be type 1 diabetes. We have a case of type 2 diabetes in which insulin is present, but not really reaching that cell phone call. you know, so the communication isn't as good. And when that communication isn't as good, then what ends up happening is that we start sending signaling, the cell starts sending a signal saying, get me more glucose, get me more glucose. And it ends up happening that the sugar starts accumulating in the blood vessel, like in the hallway or outside the cell, and therefore we see high blood sugar in type 2 diabetes. So when insulin doesn't work or insulin is non-existent, the blood sugar cannot enter the cell. That phone call cannot be made. And so it's very important to understand insulin in many of its ways, and particularly for those of our viewers who have diabetes, because some require insulin. If you're a type 2 diabetic, you might require insulin that would come in the form of an injection. Now there's an inhaled insulin, so we can go even there. But then others, like type 1 diabetes, need insulin. Without insulin, they will die. So it's a pretty critical situation, and consuming 22 teaspoons of sugar a day, Laura, I think you can only imagine how much insulin needs to be around.
And so I was actually hoping you could speak to that, because my understanding is that to trigger insulin frequently by eating sugar frequently is actually an inflammatory process. Not only can someone actually start to lose their ability to produce as much insulin in type 2 diabetes, but my understanding is that it's also inflammatory.
Yeah, you would like me to elaborate on that?
I would.
Insulin is like a growth hormone. So insulin makes things grow. And so not only does insulin make things grow, but as there is this accumulation of sugar and this stress inside the cell, being pretty much malnourished and really hungry for sugar, it creates other secretory mechanisms by which it's trying to get sugar and the body's trying to give it. So sometimes it goes to the brain and says, get me some sugar, get me some carbs. And that might be the case of a reactive low sugar. Some people have sugar, then their body goes down in the blood sugar, and then what do they need? More sugar.
And that's
so it's like a little
interesting.
vicious cycle.
It is, because you'll hear many people say they have tremendous cravings for sugar. Like they may have cravings for chocolate, and they can't get enough of it, and they eat it. Or they may have cravings for anything that has sugary types of, if they start with candy or whatever it is. Now, is that a sign for them to be aware that there may be something going on in their bodies?
And there could be other things going on. We talked about adrenal fatigue in some previous shows, when these glands that are on top of your kidneys and your back, they're almost like your batteries in some ways. They produce your stress hormones. If for some reason someone's been under a lot of stress and their output of their stress hormones isn't in an optimal place, you might crave sugar because it's a quick source of energy rather than
gives
having,
you a boost, like a
gives you a
caffeine, like a
boost.
coffee.
Right, so
Yeah.
exactly. So there could be some underlying reasons why someone could crave sugar. We've also talked about an imbalance of good and bad bugs in the gut. And sometimes when that's out of place, someone can crave sugar because of that too.
There's some people that are addicted to it. Literally,
truly.
addiction of it.
Yeah.
Well documented in the scientific literature that sugar and salt can create as bad as an addiction as those that we see in the common illicit drug use. In the studies that I have reviewed, they compare it equally to an illegal drug called cocaine.
Really?
And you brought up an interesting point with salt, how I think in American culture we are aware of salt and putting a limit on it at times, and saying, don't use more than this amount of salt in your food. But we haven't done that with sugar. We haven't necessarily promoted in the public a specific limit for sugar. And I think that that's something that would be so great if we did, because if Americans are consuming 22 teaspoons in general, that's a lot. And I don't think anyone really is counting it the way that they might calories or salt or some other things.
You make a very good point, because let's say you go out to restaurants, they give you the heart thing or whatever else, but they don't tell you how much salt or sugar. They will say some are low in salt or whatever.
Or low fat.
Or low fat, but maybe not necessarily low salt. And you hear many people talk about that there's a tremendous amount of salt in prepared foods.
Tremendous amount of salt and often a tremendous amount of sugar, at least
There
in
you go.
processed foods. There's
So
a
when you
tremendous
think
amount of
about
sugar.
it, wow, where can you get the healthiest food to eat if you don't actually be preparing it at home and really watching that? And this addiction of sugar can actually lead towards getting diabetes?
Absolutely. I think just to add to a point when we were talking about the adrenal glands, those batteries like you nicely described, the adrenal glands produce steroids. And so we commonly see those as the steroids we are given or people might be given for asthma or for when they have a significant amount of inflammation. So when you're giving it at a therapeutic level, steroids could actually be good, but they have a very dark side, which is creating this incredible amount of insulin resistance. And that kind of goes back to the hormone as we were talking in that phone call. Like every time I called you, it's busy. You know, if your phone's busy every single time, that's somewhat called like insulin resistance. And so the steroids create those cravings for sugar. And then going specifically talking about addiction, there is a concept of, is it a psychological addiction or is it a biological addiction? And so the word addiction by itself is so covered with shame and social connotations and situations of that nature that food addiction is not very much in the forefront of the conversation. And specifically, even when we're talking about diabetes or sugar, it's a little easier for us to offer a vegetarian menu, a gluten-free menu, which will be low in these sugars, but it's not really as comfortable to be in a public place, for example, in a restaurant, and say, I am diabetic and I need a diabetic menu. So it's very challenging to try to understand, you know, what is really in our food and really how we can relate it through our relationship with the food, if it's going to be a psychological situation that has developed as well as a physical, because insulin, as we generate these powerhouse pancreas that are constantly producing this insulin by virtue of those 22 spoons of sugar, the other way around is now they are unemployed. They're going around in the body going, little Mrs. Pac-Man's going, get me sugar, get me sugar.
That's right.
It's like we're zombies to that hormone, you know? And so ultimately the goal is to break the vicious cycle.
How does one break the vicious cycle? What can
Mother
one
Nature,
do to
and
stop?
I think that way you can elaborate, Mother Nature will help us.
Oh, sure, absolutely. It's a hard thing to do to change someone's diet, especially if there's a biological addiction to sugar and the emotional addiction, as you say. But you've got to start somewhere, and I often will recommend to people to do as much as you can to cut processed foods out of the diet, because that cuts out a lot of
And just for somebody,
hidden
what
sugars.
processed foods are?
Foods typically that come in a box or that when you read the ingredient label have more than 2 or 3 ingredients in it. You know, it's got a longer list and it's processed, and oftentimes you'll find a sugar product hidden in one of those ingredients on the list.
The typical hidden sugar is corn syrup.
Yes.
That is definitely one of our most inflammatory and processed sugars that we can have.
Right, and corn syrup too, and sugar as well. I know
Molasses?
molasses.
Would
Well, I was
that
going
be
to say
in
that
that
they
category or
associate that
no?
with even some liver disease and fatty liver. That really, really high intake can be a trigger for that, which is interesting. And corn syrup is actually high in mercury too.
And usually there's so many. I mean, you look at some of these labels, you can't believe all the stuff that's in it, a lot of which we don't even know. So what you're saying is anything that has more than 3 ingredients, is it?
I
in
threw
it?
3 out as a general idea.
And what would those
but
3 good ingredients be that you're looking for?
Well, it depends. I'm thinking about, certain health bars that I've seen, and the ingredients are nuts and dates. When dates are high in sugar, so someone who has a problem with sugar should be careful of that. But there are some bars or some products I've seen that have whole ingredients listed, and there are several of them. But those are fewer and farther between when it comes to a prepackaged food.
Okay, so nothing prepackaged.
Well, then nothing's in
Or
it,
to
you know.
watch.
Yes,
feel
be
like
careful with your
Watch
prepackaged food.
I have a
prepackaged.
solution for us,
Okay.
you know. So what I usually do myself, and I always want to make sure I don't forget it, because I myself, being human, we catch ourselves sometimes. But usually what I recommend to my patients is we're going to do a home inventory. and I'm talking home as in our heart and in our mind, but multiply, you start with a list of what do you think you're doing too much of. So, for example, let's think of that chocolate that we all like. I love chocolate.
Yes, me too.
And so, therefore, I go for the 100% cacao, you know, or trying to look into those ingredients where it hasn't been on a shelf for months
Right.
and things like that. But if you make a list of things that you know that you would like to change,
Right.
or at least that you're being quite repetitive, like, yeah, you know, every night I'm going to bed and I'm having a little bit of ice cream. And so every night, probably not a good idea. So you could generate your list of all the things that you know, heart to heart, are maybe becoming excessive. And then I generate a second list after that, and about the ones that are really concerning, that you know in your heart there's a priority. When you make that list, some are kind of higher up on the list. And so that second list is narrowing it down to those that are a little bit more, you know, concerning, and that only you know, and always doing it with love and compassion, as I usually say.
Correct.
And then that third list, you narrow it down to 3. 3 things that you know you want to change and you can commit yourself to change. And then at that same time, you know, give yourself a time to just, let's say, all right, I'm going to do ice cream only once a week. But then, as recently, I had a patient that was so lovely. She goes, if I could get that ice cream, I said, well, you know, how about you make it yourself? Because in a way, if you get almond milk,
Right.
if you get those ice cubes, if you get those fresh strawberries and you freeze it, now you
Right.
can even get a little indulgent and you can put some really good chocolate in there if you so wish or
There
whatnot.
you have those 3 ingredients.
There you go.
There you go. So in a way, you
Yeah.
just, at least by making it at home, they're not,
You know what you're putting in.
shelf life. They're not going to go sour. You know, there's a lot of things that prevent food from going bad, and that's the reason why they're processed.
So so right now, just as a definition, so you explain what processed food was. So just as a combination, whole foods. What's the definition of a whole food?
A whole food is a food that's in its form that grew in nature, typically. So you can walk into the produce section of a supermarket and you see an apple, and that's a whole food. And you see, you know, when you look at rice, you can see it's in its whole grain form. It hasn't been ground up into a flour or made into a gluten-free pizza crust or something like that. So that would be a processed food when it's ground up and put into the gluten-free pizza crust. But when it's in its whole form and you can recognize it as something that grew in nature, then that's a whole food.
So is there enough to eat out there that if you have a sweet craving that you can substitute it with a whole food in
Oh,
order to help that
absolutely.
and to not
Have a-
get you on the road to
have a piece of
increasing your insulin and becoming a diabetic? What would you recommend?
Well, I actually will recommend that someone might have a small piece of fruit. Some blueberries are excellent for health in so many ways, and they're not as high in sugar overall as some other pieces of fruit, and that can be a great snack. Even really dark chocolate, anything above 70%, and you can find chocolate that doesn't have a lot of added ingredients in it, and that's a really strong antioxidant and has a lot of health benefits.
So chocolate
too.
is good for you.
Chocolate above
chocolate.
70%. Good chocolate.
Good chocolate.
Good chocolate
But how
is good
much
for you.
of it is good for you? How much? Is there a limit as to how much is actually
I'd
good?
like to help you out a little bit in that
Yeah.
case, because I think, you know, it's individualized. But what we do have to our benefit is those labels. So even if we discussed a little bit, and I know I always think that there's going to be a full show on the label because
Right.
the label alone, we will go over it. But the label, first of all, we want whole foods that don't have labels. But given the fact that we do have them available to us, in the label you will be able to see, you know, for example, how many calories, how many carbohydrates, how much fiber. Because when a carbohydrate, which could be sugary, has higher fiber, so the carbohydrate to fiber ratio is important because a higher fiber is better for you. And then looking at these simple sugars versus complex sugars, and then fats, and then protein. So we don't always single eat like just blueberries. You might have blueberries in pie,
Right.
or mix it
Yogurt.
together, right?
Yep.
And so ultimately what we're trying to understand is, okay, within that, what we're about to eat, what are the compositions? What does it have? So we try to avoid too much sugar.
We should do a show on the nutrition label.
Yes,
We
that would
will.
be really
Absolutely.
good.
That's an important one because I think a lot of people don't know how to read labels, and if they begin to read labels, it can be all-consuming. It's
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, what is it telling me? Oh, I better. Is
Right.
there anything
Which
you can
one
eat?
is most important?
What
There's
can
a
you eat?
word that you cannot even pronounce.
Yeah, be
And
careful
especially
of
with
that.
my English as a second language, some of those words I even try to
Right.
pronounce just for fun,
It's like
but
a
extremely
It's
not
very
good.
true. Now, so we've covered insulin, what it is. We've covered type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. But what we didn't cover related to sugar is the whole, and we've covered the hormones and everything else, is the aspect of sugar and the hyperactivity. Because
Absolutely.
you can see it in schools when they're having the cupcakes or they're celebrating a birthday or it's Halloween or it's this time or that time. That sugar high and how people and children will act, let alone, I'm sure it's a
Absolutely.
challenge. So let's talk about
Hyperactivity, and I
that.
want to talk about heart disease next.
Please.
So with children and even with adults.
Adults too.
And with adults.
And adults, no question about
But
it.
typically children tend to eat more sugar, though that might be changing. I'd be interested to see something about that. But sugar can be such a trigger for hyperactivity and even for mood changes. I've had quite a few children come through my office with concerns about ADD, ADHD,
Yes.
and irritability. And we've done a lot of foundations of health, which I like to do, a lot of diet and really making sure there's no other medical cause. Oftentimes they've even seen other doctors to have that ruled out. And so we start with diet, we start with general hygiene, addressing things like hygiene being like video game hygiene, making sure they're not playing that all the time. But sugar seems to be the #1 trigger for kids really having some behavioral challenges.
So what do you recommend for them? Because I'm sure there are a number of listeners that would like some help with that.
I'd like to add a little bit in terms of the sugar and a very nice neighbor called magnesium. So sugar creates that hyperactivity, but it requires in order to metabolize sugar, it requires about 50 to 60 molecules of magnesium to drain and to process the sugar in the cell. So what happens with high blood sugar is that we get a relative low magnesium. And magnesium is a mineral found in our body, but pretty much in earth, in our mother nature. And it calms and it soothes. And the common typical one that we know about is Epsom salts. But one important thing is that we deplete our neurons of these very important minerals, including that one of magnesium, that usually calms us down. And so that would be one explanation. I know there's going to be many, and at the same time, behaviors that are associated with that. And ultimately, when a person's consuming a lot of glucose and a lot of sugar, they eventually become malnourished. Here we think, a sugary liquid is going to be helping nutrition, but if anything, sometimes they're empty calories, create hyperactivity, can create weight gain.
And it's funny because you don't think of someone being overweight as being malnourished, but they really can be. They can be really depleted in nutrients.
Particularly magnesium, because sugar is a magnesium robber.
And there's some, obviously in fruits, there's some level of sugar in it as a whole food.
There are, but as Margarita was talking about before, in fruit, there's also typically a lot of fiber, and so there's that balancing
There's a balance
effect.
in there, so people don't need to be concerned about that.
Well, it depends. If you're eating
Everything in
only
moderation.
fruit all day,
Right.
you might
So you
run
need
into
a
some trouble,
combination.
but it's a lot better than the sugar, say, that's in a soda.
So rather than having orange juice that is processed,
Right.
and it has been pasteurized,
Right.
it has been treated so it doesn't go bad in the refrigerator of our grocery store for days on end,
Right.
you can have the orange.
Right.
Right? And so ultimately my rule of thumb with fruits is if you can bite into it and chew,
Then it's
that
good
will
for
have
you.
the fiber. And then usually the less ripe,
That's right.
less sugar.
Really?
Yeah.
Less, right? Less sugar, but it tastes better when it's more
Yeah.
ripe, isn't it?
More sugary.
More sugary, okay. So how about acidity?
Oh, sugar triggering acidity? Yes, that's a really interesting question. So we do know that intake of sugar, intake of other foods, processed foods, and a high intake of meats oftentimes can increase the acidity of the body, which is actually lowering the pH. Now, the blood itself has to stay at a very particular pH for us to stay alive and stay healthy. So the body does certain things to keep it at that level. And one thing that it might do is pull minerals out of the bones, actually, to keep the blood pH at a really stable level. So intake of sugar can actually be a trigger for osteoporosis. Not something that a lot of people know, but when sugar is high for a long period of time, it's leaching those minerals to keep the pH of the blood at the stable level that we need to stay alive.
So usually, so sugars create, I love what you just said, that was so well said, but sugars create that acidity. So for example, what we're trying to do in our gut is all this overuse of antacids in situations like that. You have something sugary, there goes your reflux, there goes the antacid, and there goes the low magnesium. But in terms of acid and alkaline, the blood being alkaline and trying to maintain that pH, even similar to that of the ocean, which is so beautiful in a more metaphysical way. You know, when the blood becomes acidic, we are pretty much starting to die. Cells die off in an acid environment. And so there's a lot of conversation about the acid-alkaline environment inside our body needs to be alkaline, and outside our body needs to be a little acid. So that's good.
And I just want to mention, I know we're limited on our time in our show, but a lot of people don't recognize the effects of sugar on heart disease. And I think we really need to mention that we, you know, we think about cholesterol and fats as being trigger for heart disease, but the latest research that's coming out is really showing that sugar is very inflammatory. It's triggering a lot of what's contributing to heart disease. And also, you can measure it in the marker. Something called triglycerides is a fat. But it's a fat that's produced from excess intake of sugar, and we're linking that measurement of triglycerides with heart disease. And so it's just something that I don't think enough people are aware of.
That's a great point, and I know we should do a show really soon on this, because we are so focused on the LDL and the HDL cholesterol, and not always do we look at triglycerides, but it's well documented in the medical literature that if your triglycerides are high, you have very high risk of diabetes.
Yep, and heart disease.
And of course, yes, heart disease.
Very interesting. So as you're listening to the program, if at any time in any of the shows that we're doing, you have any questions or an interest in another topic or an additional topic from what we've begun with, please email us at info@ycdholistichealing.com. We very much are very interested in your thoughts and your feedback, and to let us know also if you find these programs helpful to you. Our goal is to provide you information that empowers you to make positive choices in your health and well-being. We wish you a wonderful day. Thank you for being with us. Be well and take excellent care of yourself. We'll see you soon.
The preceding program